Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in the Harvard Classics Lectures. We are now in lecture number 114, Thoreau's Walden, chapter 15, Winter Animals. Now, of course, this is in some ways, a follow-up to the previous chapter, number 14. The notion of who else were the inhabitants of the woods. But here, instead of the humans, we're going to concentrate now on the animals. I told you, we've got this kind of interesting dance back and forth. Some will see this as the chapter as Thoreau as zoologists. And I kind of like that idea. He's a naturalist all the way through, but he's got an amazing eye, and he's going to talk about animals specifically as it relates to the experience of being in and around Walden woods, especially in the winter time. Now, our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net, especially from the Harvard Classics folder, lectures 99 through 113, as well as the junior folder, and as well that you're familiar with our three levels of reading. At level 1, what does the text say? At level 2, what does the text mean? 2a, themes, messages. At 2b, the rhetorical level. And again, we'll play the same game, especially of symbolism, through this chapter number 15. And then finally, at level 3, how can I relate to this information in some meaningful way? At 3a to other chapters, and we've already made a relationship already to chapter 14, and then as well to other texts that we are familiar with. And then finally, at 3b, how can I relate to this stuff personally? And that's always the challenge. And a chapter like this is sometimes hard for my students in terms of relating to it personally. I'll do my best to try and make it real to you, I hope. And then finally, our assumptions are that you're familiar with what we call our big 5 in 303. What does this text say about epistemology, what we can know? Ontology, who we are. Psychology, the study of the individual mind. Sociology, the study of the collective mind. And finally, theodicy, the question of why is it that bad things happen? Evil and pain and suffering happen to us in this world. And we're going to get some insights on all of this, especially the theodicea question, as we talk about the shooting of a fox. And it's going to be a kind of compelling passage, actually. Now, it's sad to me that some people actually consider this a throwaway chapter in Walden, and I think it's actually one of the more important chapters in Walden, especially as it relates to Thoreau's incredible eye. I mean, he's just got an amazing eye for the things that he sees. Let's do a real quick summary, and then we'll get to some of the reading. Here again, he's going to take up the subject of these winter animals, and he's going to try to give us a new view, or some have even argued a fresh perspective, if you will. He'll take a look at the landscape from frozen Flint's Pond. He comments on how wide and strange it all appears, and then he writes about the winter sounds of the hoot owl, the ice on the pond, of the ground cracking, of the wild animals and their sounds, of a hunter and his hounds. And all of it comes back to all of the different senses, especially what one can hear. And then finally, he'll describe this rabbit, this hare, kind of pathetic and trembling, that shows unbelievable energy as it then jumps away, obviously demonstrating for Thoreau what he calls, quote, the vigor and the dignity of nature. Now, as I've said in all my lectures, I would love to be able to just read all of this, and I do. I love this chapter. I'm going to devote this chapter, actually, I'm going to dedicate it to a lover of squirrels, who is my father-in-law, Larry Brewster. He loves squirrels, so I'm going to dedicate this to him, and we'll have a great description of squirrels in this chapter. The opening lines. When the ponds were firmly frozen, they afforded not only new and shorter routes to many points, but new views from their surfaces of the familiar landscape around them. When I crossed Flint's Pond after it was covered with snow, though I had often paddled about and skated over it, it was so unexpectedly wide and so strange that I could think of nothing but Baffin's Bay. The Lincoln Hills rose up around me at the extremity of a snowy plain in which I did not remember to have stood before, and the fishermen at an indeterminable distance over the ice, moving slowly about with their wolfish dogs. This will sound so much for us like that notion of perspectives are so new when we take different observations. I remember once, and we play this game regularly at 303, that you'll remember sometimes, I remember the first time that I did it, I remember once the first time I did it where I had all our students lie down on the floor to study 303 from a different perspective, and commenting on all the gum that was sticking on the underside of the old tables that we used to have in 303. That notion that Swift will play in Gulliver's Travels as well, how so much is about perspective, and of course it's all Platonist at that point, right? And he finishes, he says, I took this course when I went to lecture in Lincoln in the evening, traveling in no road and passing no house between my own hut and the lecture room. A few lines later he says that as he was considering some of the sounds in winter nights, he was startled by a loud honking of a goose. And he says, stepping to the door, I heard the sound of their wings, like a tempest. We think immediately, of course, of Shakespeare 3A and his famous Tempest in the woods as they flew low over my house. Now, of course, we are privileged out here in Walden to be able to hear this kind of thing periodically of the geese flying overhead. They passed over the pond toward Fairhaven, seemingly deterred from setting by my light, their Commodore honking all the while with a regular beat. Suddenly, just to continue, an unmistakable cat owl from very near me, with the most harsh and tremendous voice I'd ever heard from any inhabitant of the woods, responded at regular intervals to the goose. So you're going to get a cat owl who's going to respond down to the goose, as if determined to expose and disgrace this intruder from Hudson's Bay by exhibiting a greater compass and volume of voice in a native and boo-hoo him out of Concord horizon. What do you mean by alarming the citadel at this time of night consecrated to me? And you can imagine, he's speaking for the owl now, right? Do you think I'm ever caught napping at such an hour? And that I have not got lungs and a larynx as well as yourself? And then you have this boo-hoo, 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 all the way, you know, the attempt to try to capture some of the language of the owl. It was one of the most thrilling discords I've ever heard, he says. And yet, if you had a discriminating ear, there were in it the elements of a concord such as these plains never saw nor heard. He says, I also heard the whooping of the ice in the pond, my great bedfellow in that part of Concord, as if it were restless in its bed and would fain turn over were it troubled with flatulency and bad dreams. I mean, how many writers can talk about the ice as farting? I mean, this is what he means by this flatulency and bad dreams, right? Or he says, I was wakened by the cackling of the ground by the frost, as if someone had driven a team against my door, and in the morning could find a crack in the earth 1/4 of a mile and 1/3 of an inch wide. It's wonderful that he has this capacity. Two things I would say for your notes. One, he has the capacity to recreate the most natural, mundane kind of occurrences in some compelling language. But I think the more important thing, and it's a 3A observation, or 3B observation, he challenges us to recognize how regularly we are so inept at paying attention to the simplest things that are going on around us. Many have reported that once they've read Walden, they find themselves, whatever it is they're doing, walking in the woods or walking in a mall or walking in a school hall, it doesn't matter, to begin to pay more attention, to see things around us. Next he moves on to the foxes. Sometimes he said, I heard the foxes as they ranged over the snow crust in moonlit nights in search of a partridge or other game, barking raggedly and demonically like forest dogs, as if laboring with some anxiety or seeking expression, struggling for light and to be dogs outright and to run freely in the streets. For if we take the ages into our account, he says it this way, for if we take the ages into our account, may there not be a civilization going on among brutes as well as men. This is a compelling idea. In other words, we kind of work off the assumption that the animals on this planet do not engage in similar kinds of civilization as we have experienced in our lives. They seemed to me, now he's talking about foxes, they seem to me to be rudimental, burrowing men, still standing on their defense, awaiting their transformation. Sometimes one came near to my window, attracted by my light, barked a vulpine curse at me, and then retreated. He said, one would approach, just a few lines later, one would approach, at first warily, through the shrub oaks, running over the snow crust by its fits and starts like a leaf blown by the wind. Now a few paces this way with wonderful speed and waste of energy, making inconceivable haste with his trotters as if he were a wager, and now as many paces that way, but never getting no more than half a rod at a time, and then suddenly pausing with a ludicrous expression and a gratuitous somerset, as if all the eyes in the universe were fixed on him. By the way, here, I should have pointed out, I apologize, we're reading now about a red squirrel, and he loves to talk about how these squirrels, they never seem to walk anywhere, and then they'll pause, and it's as if all the eyes of the universe were fixed on them. And those of us that love to watch squirrels, we're like, hey, that's a great way to say it, you know. For all the motions of a squirrel, even in the most solitary recesses of the forest, implies spectators as much as those of a dancing girl. All squirrels seem to kind of know everyone's watching them all the time, wasting more time in delay and circumspection than would have sufficed to walk the whole distance. I never saw one walk, he says, and then suddenly, before you could say Jack Robinson, he'd be in the top of a young pitch pine, winding up his clock and chiding all the imaginary spectators, soliloquizing and talking to all the universe at the same time, for no reason that I could ever detect, or he himself was aware of, I suspect. So his appreciation of the squirrels comes next. Then he talks about the jays as they arrive. Then he talks about the chickadees, and he tells us even about a sparrow that lands on his shoulder. So, I mean, here he is. He's working so long in nature with the wildlife that he begins to be accepted. He says, I once had a sparrow alight upon my shoulder for a moment while I was hoeing in a village garden, and I felt that I was more distinguished by that circumstance than I should have been by any epaulette I could have worn. He says, the squirrels also grew at last to be quite familiar and occasionally stepped upon my shoe when that was the nearest way. And I love it that he drops a line like the nearest way. Of course, he's reminding us that this is exactly what Lady Macbeth says about her husband. He lacks the courage to catch the nearest way. I love how Thoreau does that kind of thing, a 3A observation. And then he continues. And now we're talking about the sounds of the hounds. In dark winter mornings, or in short winter afternoons, I sometimes heard a pack of hounds threading all the woods with hounding cry and yelp, unable to resist the instinct of the chase and the note of the hunting horn at intervals, proving that man was in the rear. The woods ring again, and yet no fox bursts forth into the open level of the pond, nor following pack pursuing their action. And perhaps at evening I see the hunters returning with a single brush, trailing from their sleigh for a trophy seeking therein. They tell me that if the fox would remain in the bosom of the frozen earth, he would be safe, or if he would run in a straight line away, no foxhound could overtake him. But having left his pursuers far behind, he stops to rest and listen till they come up. And when he runs, he circles round to his old haunts where the hunters await him. I find this an interesting idea, and of course a powerful metaphor, that the fox could just get away if the fox didn't have the temptation to stop and look backwards, right? He says a few lines later, late in the afternoon, he's talking now about a hunter, as he was resting in the thick woods south of Walden, he heard the voice of the hounds far over toward Fairhaven, still pursuing a fox. And on they came, their hounding cry, which made all the woods ring, sounding nearer and nearer, now from Well Meadow, now from the Baker farm. For a long time, this hunter stood still and listened to their music. Now, this hunter is telling Thoreau about this experience he had. So sweet to a hunter's ear. When suddenly, the fox appeared, threading the solemn aisles with an easy coursing pace whose sound was counseled by a sympathetic rustle of the leaves. Swift and still, keeping the ground, leaving his pursuers far behind, and leaping upon a rock amid the rocks, he sat erect and listening with his back to the hunter. For a moment, compassion restrained the latter's arm. But that was a short-lived mood, and as quick as thought can follow, thought his piece was leveled, and whang! The fox, rolling over the rock, lay dead on the ground. Now, this is the end of a story where hounds have been hunting this fox all day, and in the early part of the day, came in front of the hunter, and the hunter said, I almost took a shot, but he was so fast I couldn't get a shot off. Now, the hunter is sitting, the fox doesn't realize that the hunter is there. He comes back, and he literally sits right where the hunter can knock him down with his firearm, because the hounds are now chasing him later in the day. And whack, the fox rolling over the rock lay dead on the ground. The hunter still kept his place and listened to the hounds. Still on they came. And now the near woods resounded through all their aisles with their demonic cry. At length, the old hound, who'd been chasing, of course, with the younger behind, burst into view with muzzle to the ground and snapping the air as it possessed, and ran directly to the rock. But spying the dead fox, she suddenly ceased her hounding as if struck dumb with amazement, and walked around and around him in silence, and one by one her pups arrived, and like their mother were sobered into silence by the mystery. Then the hunter came forward and stood in their midst, and the mystery was solved. They waited in silence while he skinned the fox, then followed the brush a while, and at length turned off into the woods again. It's a fascinating little story, and I think it can be read at multiple levels. But the idea that all of life has this interesting cyclical nature to it, right? And the poor fox ultimately gets his in the end, right? He continues a few lines later by talking about the deer, and he says, "At midnight, when there was a moon, I sometimes met with hounds in my path, prowling about the woods, which would skulk out of my way as if afraid and stand silent amid the bushes till I had passed." He says, "Squirrels and wild mice disputed for my store of nuts. There were scores of pitch pines around my house from 1 to 4 inches in diameter, which had been gnawed by mice the previous winter, a Norwegian winter for them. For the snow lay long and deep, and they were obliged to mix a large proportion of pine bark with their other diet. These trees," now he's back to trees, "were alive and apparently flourishing at midsummer, and many of them had grown a foot, though completely girdled. But after another winter, such were without exception dead," because they're getting chewed on, right? He says it's it is remarkable, he says, "that a single mouse should thus be allowed a whole pine tree for its dinner, gnawing round instead of up and down it." But then Thoreau says something interesting. "Perhaps it's necessary in order to thin these trees, which are wont to grow up densely." I find this fascinating. In other words, everything in nature has its balancing power. Of course, we immediately think of William Blake and his Songs of Innocence, Songs of Experience. You can go back and find those lectures at Armstrong as well. He then goes to the hares, and he loves to talk about the rabbits or the hares. And he says, "What is a country without rabbits and partridges? They are among the most simple and indigenous animal products, ancient and venerable families, known to antiquity as to modern times, of the very hue and substance of nature, nearest allied to leaves and to the ground, and to one another. It's either winged or it's legged. It's hardly as if you've seen a wild creature. When a rabbit or a partridge bursts away, only a natural one, as much to be expected as rustling leaves. The partridge and the rabbit are still sure to thrive. Like true natives of the soil, whatever revolutions occur. If the forest is cut off, the sprouts and bushes which spring up afford them concealment, and they become more numerous than ever. That must be a poor country indeed that does not support a hare. Our woods teem with them, both and around. Every swamp may be seen the partridge or rabbit walk, beset with twangy fences and horsehair snares, which some cowboy tends." Well, this is a beautiful chapter about all of the connectivity of life, right? The vigor and the dignity of nature. Let's get ready now to move on to chapter 16, and we are coming now to the end of Walden. I hope your reading is challenging you here and you're enjoying it as well. Thank you.